on U.S. intelligence agencies. The 1976 report led to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the special court that approves domestic surveillance. The discussion includes a look at the NSA's warrantless wiretapping program. Hosted by the University of Kentucky, it's about an hour and a half.
Good evening. I'm Carol Diedrichs, the Dean of Libraries here at the University of Kentucky. I'm pleased for this opportunity to welcome you to Memorial Hall and the University of Kentucky campus. It's quite fitting that this historic hall, where many public issues have been debated and discussed, once again hosts an important program to all Americans. The UK Library's Wendell H. Ford Public Policy Research Center is proud to sponsor this event, and we're pleased that Senator Ford is able to be with us this evening. Senator Ford, thank you for all that you've done for UK and for your role in developing the Ford Center. It also gives me great pleasure to recognize our Provost, Kumbal Subaswamy. It is his leadership that helps us, along with President Todd's, to continue building the UK libraries as a major component in UK's goal to become a top 20 public research university. The UK School of Journalism and Telecommunications and the First Amendment Center are co-sponsors for this event, and I want to take this opportunity to thank our colleagues Dean David Johnson, Director Beth Barnes, and Professor Mike Farrell for all of their help and support. I also want to welcome C-SPAN and thank them for making this event available to a national audience. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not thank UK Public Relations for their outstanding work promoting this evening's program. It's a tremendous honor to the University of Kentucky that this distinguished panel has joined us tonight for this provocative and timely discussion. Introducing our panelist and serving as moderator for the evening is Dr. Tracy Campbell. Dr. Campbell is a University of Kentucky professor of history and also serves as co-director of the Ford Public Policy Research Center. Dr. Campbell specializes in the social and political history of the United States and is the author of numerous articles and books, including Short of the Glory, The Fall and Redemption of Edward F. Pritchard, Jr., and his most recent book, Deliver the Vote, A History of Election Fraud, An American Political Tradition, 1742 to 2004. Dr. Campbell.
I want to welcome all of you as well to an event I think you'll find not only historical but timely for our discussion tonight. It's a remarkable thing for a government to investigate itself, especially regarding its most deeply held secrets and the manner by which they are obtained. In 1975, after an expose by New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh revealed that the CIA was conducting illegal intelligence operations against American citizens, the U.S. Senate appointed a select committee to investigate our intelligence gathering methods. Over the next year and a half, the 11 members of the committee, headed by Idaho's Frank Church, held hearings on a variety of topics. What they uncovered was stunning. For example, CIA involvement in the assassination attempts of various foreign leaders, the FBI's COINTEL program to discredit the civil rights movement, the illegal wiretappings of over 1 million citizens, including Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., And I should mention one of the very first was Kentucky's Ed Pritchard and his White House telephone. That NSA computers were fed every single overseas cable for nearly 30 years. That the CIA had conducted drug experiments on unsuspecting subjects. And the infamous Houston plan that came from the Nixon White House that advocated illegal surveillance of suspected administration opponents, a plan that even J. Edgar Hoover rejected. The Church Committee asked the profound question of how a government balances personal liberties with national security. Some saw the work of the committee as a heroic investigation against an unchecked executive branch, while others saw it as an unnecessary airing of our intelligence gathering methods that exposed some of our deepest and sometimes most embarrassing secrets that actually undermined our national security. In the end, the committee was instrumental in writing a number of key reforms, including establishing a permanent Senate Intelligence Committee, as well as producing what became known as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, that is at the heart and center of contemporary debate over warrantless wiretaps. In 1976, the Church Committee divided its duties into two subcommittees, one concerning foreign intelligence, the other domestic. And the two men who headed those subcommittees are with us tonight, as well as the committee's chief counsel. This is a reunion, then, a rare reunion, of three of the key players involved in one of the most significant investigations in American history. And they're not only uniquely qualified to give us their notions on the legacy of the Church Committee, but they can also help us think how we might interpret the laws they helped craft. On my left, my immediate left, is Walter F. Mondale, who was born in Ceylon, Minnesota in 1928, and after earning a BA and a law degree from the University of Minnesota, practiced law in Minneapolis. He served as Minnesota's Attorney General until 1964, and he was appointed to fill the U.S. Senate seat vacated by Hubert Humphrey's ascension to the vice presidency. He was twice elected to the Senate in his own right and served there until 1976, when, of course, he followed Hubert Humphrey's path and was elected the 42nd Vice President of the United States. And in 1984, he was the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. From 1993 to 96, he was the American ambassador to Japan, and today he serves as general counsel in the law firm of Dorsey and Whitney in Minneapolis. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome to University of Kentucky Vice President Walter F. Mondale. To his left is Walter D. Huddleston, who was born in Burkesville, Kentucky in 1926, and after serving in the U.S. Army, graduated from here at the University of Kentucky in 1949. He became a prominent radio station operator in the 1950s before entering the world of Kentucky politics. He was elected to the state Senate in 1964 and rose to become majority leader in 1970. In 1972, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he served until 1985. He lives today in Elizabethtown, and his collection of political papers are proudly stored here at the University of Kentucky. And maybe we should add that the university has no finer friend than this gentleman. Would you please welcome Walter D. Huddleston. And on my far left is Mr. Frederick A.O. Schwartz, Jr., who was born in New York City in 1935, was graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, where he was editor of the Law Review. After clerking for the Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals Second Circuit, he joined the law firm of Cravath, Swain, and Moore, and he was elected partner in 1969. He served as chief counsel to the Church Committee in the mid-1970s, and is currently still with Cravath, Swain, and Moore, and is also senior counsel with the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. Next March, the New Press will publish a book he co-wrote with Aziz Huq titled Unchecked and Unbalanced, Presidential Power in a time of terror. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please also welcome Mr. Frederick A.L. Schwartz, Jr. Gentlemen, you promised me there'd be no filibusters tonight. So, all of you, let me start out by asking all of you. You all came to the church committee with varied backgrounds. As the investigation began and unfolded, were you surprised at anything you found? Was it a shocking process? Was it just a pleasant surprise? And what disturbed you more than anything else? If we could start with you, Mr. Vice President.
Well, if I can start by thanking Dee for bringing us together, inviting me down here. Dee and I are old friends, and we served together, as you mentioned, on this intelligence committee during one of the most remarkable, dynamic periods in, I would say, modern Senate history. And I have a lot of affection for Dee Huddleston, and I'm glad to be here with him.
Thank you. Thank you.
And both of us are glad to be here with Fred Schwartz, who had the job of being general counsel in what could probably be the most challenging range of legal and policy problems at one time in my memory, at least. And he performed magnificently. And to be with Wendell Ford, a Kentucky giant, a dear friend, and a possessor of some of the worst jokes I've ever heard in my life. Yes, I think we were all surprised by the magnitude and the depth of what we saw. If I can just say this, we need a strong FBI, we need a strong CIA and an NSA. We have enemies, and we have to deal with them, and every one of us wanted to make certain when we got done that part was not compromised and indeed enhanced. I was chairman of the domestic task force, and we were looking at agencies that dealt domestically, not just the FBI, but the Army and many other agencies that had become involved in one way or another. And when we got into the records, and ours was the only committee probably that's ever looked at a complete, unprotected files of the Bureau and these other agencies with virtually no restrictions on us at all, sending staff and experts into those files. And when they started coming back, I remember once he said, "I can't believe what I read today." And he'd gotten into COINTELPRO, where they had targeted thousands and thousands of people for investigation based on no violation of the law, just hunches and suspicions, where they were tracking down Martin Luther King, who had committed no crimes, but they were tapping him, they were covering him, they were on his case all the time, and they were trying to dismantle him as a leader of the civil rights movement. And there were many, we'll go into a lot of other things, I'm sure, before the night is over, but the fact that this could happen in America, this nation of laws and accountability, and happen over so many years. Presidents of both political parties were involved in this. It was a bipartisan thing, and there was a lot of this that the agencies had to explain that were the result, directly or indirectly, of pressure from above. Yes, we were surprised.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Vice President Senator Mondale. I still call him Senator because I believe that was the highest office that he held. He was a tremendous senator and a tremendous member of the intelligence committees, and we were friends from the very start. And of course, our chief counsel, who did a tremendous job. It's hard to explain to people the work really that the committee staff people do, because us guys get all the credit. And they do the heavy lifting. They do the hard work. He had a staff under him, and they did a tremendous job dealing with organizations of our government that were not accustomed to having to disclose their operations to anybody. And it was a touch and go, very meticulous kind of thing. To compare us with our situation over in the House, the committee over there on intelligence, who were continually issuing subpoenas to the major operators of our government. And Fritz and his crew worked with them, kept developing, kept moving. We'd get a little bit of information now, we get a little bit of information more, some of them very reluctant to give any. But in the final analysis, we got enough to make some determinations that went into our final report. And Fred Schwartz was a major part of being able to do that. Now, I feel in a very comfortable position here. I'm between two Fritzes, which I was for the entire time of our investigating committee. And of course, this Fritz, who happens to be the son of a Methodist minister, as I am, and who happens to have the name of Walter, which I have. And we both learned early that you didn't want to be called Walter. So he's called Fritz, and I'm called D. And that's the way I hope it stays. At any rate, a little background of how this committee ever came about. It wasn't the impetus of the Congress, the initiative of the Senate. It really came about because principally the New York Times, the Seymour Hersh article that was referred to, opened the floodgates to all of these things that they had discovered that the intelligence community had been involved in, unlawful, most of them. And that was taken up by many other journalists, and there was a whole flood of stories coming out across the nation about the improprieties and the misdeeds of our intelligence community. Now, I know that all of us, and I think of most of the members in the Congress, felt like we had to have a good intelligence operation. But the impetus for these hearings came from a belief of many of us that if we were going to continue to have an effective intelligence operation, we had to do something to address these reports that were coming out. And we had to find out what was happening and then take whatever action was necessary to correct them. And so that was the basis of our going into this very difficult field. It was the first time ever in the history of the country that any group ever sat down and looked at the entire intelligence operation of our country at the same time. There was one senator who was reported to by the Intelligence Committee on what they were doing. And he kept it to himself. No, I was amazed when this first idea began to come that we ought to have an investigating committee. I talked to several of the veteran senators, and most of them said, we don't want to know. I don't want to know what the CIA is doing. I don't know what our intelligence committee is doing. Well, that was fine until these revelations began to come. So the real impetus didn't come from any senator who said, well, it's time for us to launch a big investigation. It came after these stories appeared and the people in the country began to wonder what is going on. A survey was taken, and by a percentage of 62 in favor versus 18 against, the people said that there should be more oversight of our intelligence operations. And from that point on, we began to address that problem, and that's why the intelligence committees were formed, and all that's happened since then.
Well, it was a thrill for me to have a chance to work with these two senators and the other 9 senators on the committee. I'd known none of them before, and we had a really collegial atmosphere. Yes, some differences, but the differences weren't partisan, and the Senate was, I think, a very different place then than it is today. You mentioned that Senator Mondale, you said I still call him Senator. Well, I still call him Fritz, and I like to say, and I'm sure this is historically accurate, that if Senator Mondale had run as Fritz Mondale instead of Walter Mondale, he would be president today. That's a couple of things that I think were really important. Senator Mondale touched on one of them. We established through the facts that there had been overreaching by the intelligence community and improper guidance by presidents all the way from Franklin Roosevelt through Richard Nixon. Many people thought when we started it would just be more if Nixon was a bad person, and there was plenty of that was uncovered. But Roosevelt started it off by loose language in authorizing the FBI, and all of the others did things that were bad. Another thing I think that's important about the Church Committee is it asked the right questions, and I think the two fundamental questions were, should America adopt the tactics of the enemy? It's a question of today also, but that was a real issue, and we concluded it shouldn't, but there had been a great deal of adopting those tactics by our secret government. And the other major question was, should the American people be allowed to know what the facts are? And the whole, our work was entirely devoted to helping the American people know what the facts are. And the final thing in the sort of this opening, the Church Committee, as both of you said, it's important to have a strong FBI and a strong CIA. The question is, what are they going to do? And taking the FBI, Roosevelt started them off in the wrong direction by asking them to investigate subversion, a word that has no content and has no limits. And subversion was the excuse of investigating and attempting to destroy Martin Luther King, for example. Well, in our final reports, we said what the FBI should be doing is looking at espionage and terrorism, and there we were a little ahead of the times, looking at espionage and terrorism instead of subversion.
Yeah, we were talking before. You had the NSA director, Lou Allen, come before the committee and say in 1975 that warrantless wiretaps had stopped what he said was a major terrorist attack in an American city. He didn't elaborate on that. And if any of you three want to elaborate on it, feel free to do so. But does that prove that warrantless wiretaps work?
Let me say that I think that's a very false dichotomy, because the same thing can be done through legal process. We've now had FISA in place, the law you referred to, for, what, 25 years? Yeah. I think almost many attorneys general, many FBI directors, many CIA directors said that these laws work very well. They were able to do what they wanted to do. The idea behind getting a warrant was not to hold back law enforcement officers from doing what had to be done, but making certain there was a judge there just to be sure that they didn't go beyond what was legal and right and appropriate, and because of the history we had seen. And so I believe there's this constant debate, which we hear today, that if you obey the law, you're weak. That there's something that the founders of America did that intentionally made us impotent in the face of our enemies. I don't think that's true at all. The Constitution, the laws, the power of the Congress, the President, under the law, gives us the full panoply of power that is needed, both in secret and in public. But it does it without allowing human nature in a position of unaccountable power, which, when not observed, we've found to our despair time and time again over American history, there's something about us that we tend to do more than we should if we're not being watched.
Is there ever a circumstance when a warrantless wiretap could be authorized?
Well, this law, I'll shut up here. This law allows, in a case of emergency, in case of a war, in case of what they call hot pursuit, they can go at it right there. But they have to bring it to a court, and they've got a special court that's there available to them within 72 hours now. I think it's a week or something. But they have plenty of time to do what they have to do if an emergency permits no time at all.
And this so-called, I think it's referred to as a court many times. It's not a court. It's 3 judges, I believe, that are available 24 hours of the day. It's not as if you've got to sit around and wait till you can get scheduled. They can do it in 30 minutes and get and I think over the 20-something years they've turned down about 2. So it's almost a guaranteed thing. And as Senator Mondale said, they've got 72 hours. They can do it without even checking. And if they can't find, they can find a lot in 72 hours, I would take. But at any rate, I believe that it is adequate to meet the needs. The situation is a little different now than it was back then. We were dealing with the so-called communist scare and the increasing of communist domination around various places in the country, which we, in my judgment, very much overplayed because it was doomed to fail in the first place. But at any rate, that was the big thing in those days, and it was a little different now with the terrorist scare, which operates a little different than the communist scare. But at any rate, I believe that it was adequate the way the committee and the subsequent legislation that was passed in 1980 provided a way to do what needed to be done when they needed to do it, but also with enough restraint to have to come to somebody and say, look, we're tapping all these phones and here's the reason why. And if the reason is not justified, then they shouldn't continue to impinge on a citizen's privacy.
Well, what's the real threat? Why not err on the side of tapping into a suspected terrorist phone or email? What is the real threat?
We're doing all that, incidentally.
Tell us what.
Let me take a try on that, sort of a little indirectly. The key to the Church Committee was developing the facts, because if you don't have the facts, you don't know you can't know the truth. And statements, general statements that are made by administration officials then or today, often are devoid of real facts. Now, taking the NSA, it was a perfect example of a phenomenon that we saw all the time, which is if you have a program, a intelligence agency's program, that may start out with a narrow and rather valid purpose. And the NSA started getting every single cable that was sent overseas for a quite valid purpose, which was to be able to obtain and then decode encrypted messages that were being sent by foreign embassies. And nobody's going to think that's a bad thing to do. But what happened with the NSA happened with all the other agencies, that because they were immune from any oversight, because they believed what they were doing would always be secret, what started small expanded from the acceptable to the unacceptable. So NSA, starting with looking at the encrypted messages of foreign embassies, ends up looking at the messages by anti-Vietnam War protesters in this country and civil rights leaders in this country. And that's a perfect example of mission creep. It shows why you can't rely on generalizations coming from people defending their programs, but find out what the real facts are.
Can I just jump in here a minute, if I can? Dee said accurately that the situation has changed some since we issued our report, all kinds of changes in electronic communication, this and that. But it is still the fact that this law works, and it is being proposed in the Senate committee by Dianne Feinstein. It's passed the committee 10-8 with Lindsey Graham and Specter, so it's a bipartisan bill that goes to the agencies, ask them, what do you need now? What kind of changes in this 25-year-old law do you feel you need to allow you to do what you must do to protect America, but still do it within the law, still have some accountability? And that law has about 14 different points, all of them reasonable. Sure, we should adjust it. Sure, we should make it work. But we have a big stake as Americans in guaranteeing that our system of constitutional law is sustained. Every big power that was around when America was formed decided its future was to be found in some kind of imperial, magisterial power with no rights to the citizens. We started with the idea that this would be a government of the people, by the people, and under the laws of our country. Read the oath of office of the president, read the Constitution, read the Federalist Papers. We wanted a government that was accountable. And that has made America, I believe, more than anything else, the greatest and the strongest nation on earth. And we lose something when we take lightly this idea of constitutional and legal rights of our people.
Now you see why I brought these two guys squeezed in the middle. I think
sorry, you go.
I was just going to say, sometimes you win a point.
Your microphone.
Right. People sacrifice our freedoms for a temporary situation in the long term. Can't hear you.
I think Mike has slipped off.
Disappeared.
Where'd it go?
There it is.
You're sitting on it.
That was about 25 years in broadcasting industry. Never did understand these things.
Okay.
You can win a battle and lose the war if you give away too much to deal with a situation that exists. I think we believe, and people that look at it believe, that the weapons are there, the procedures are there to deal with virtually any kind of situation we're confronted with without violating the basic First Amendment rights of the people of the country.
It's an issue of checks and balances as well as an issue of the First Amendment rights. I mean, they're both equally important. But what's being debated right now is a really radical position that the current administration is taking. Their position is that the United States President has the right to break the law if he thinks it is important to do that. Now, that is not the way our country was constructed. It was not constructed to set up a monarch. In fact, we revolted against the English because we didn't want a monarch. And even the English had abandoned the idea of the king having the right to break the law in 1689, almost 100 years before our revolution. So the thesis that's being tested right now is totally radical, an enormous departure from American culture and law, and extremely important that it not be sanctioned by the Congress or accepted by the public.
I wanted to bring up the issue. One of the things the Church Committee spent a lot of time looking at was the issue of assassinations, or the attempted assassinations of leaders like Castro and Allende. With 30 years now behind you, is there ever an instance in which a president should be allowed to order the assassination of a foreign leader or official?
I can't think necessarily what it would be. There are reasons sometimes for declaring war on a country, and if you do that, then presumably you're out to kill anybody you can from that. But in the absence of that kind of a situation, the declaration of war, I don't know that you can justify that. Where do you stop? I mean, after President Bush listened to the two guys that spoke to the United Nations the last couple of days, he might figure we ought to eliminate it. Those two guys pretty quick. But that wouldn't be right, would it? But
why not?
I don't. That's another interesting subject about our relationship with those two particular countries. But the point is, where do you stop? If you go down that road that, look, somebody we don't agree with, just erase them. Now, that was part of the culture back when we first started looking at this thing, all of the schemes they dreamed up to do away with Castro would make a pretty good book in itself, And it was a very interesting thing. They tried every possible way, you know, they were going to poison his cigars and put something in him that would make his beard fall out, and all kinds of things, and fortunately none of them occurred. But an interesting thing, during all of that, they had the officials of the United States government met with two major mafia figures in Miami Beach, Florida, to determine how they could assassinate Castro. A fellow by the name of Sam Giaconti and John Rosselli. And as Fritz remembers, we learned about that, and we subpoenaed those two guys to come before our committee. Well, Sam ran into an accident before he could get there. He was shot down in his kitchen in Chicago. Isn't that right? But Mr. Rosselli did come and made a very interesting witness. He was a debonair, nice-looking fellow, gray hair. You'd think he was a bank president or something. And he testified, and we learned all about the plot to get to Castro. And I guess it was about 6 months after that, his body was found in a barrel floating in Biscayne Bay off of Florida. We never...
Making me real comfortable sitting here talking to you.
Yeah, right. You guys a little closer. We were in a dangerous business. Yeah. We should have gotten combat pay. But at any rate, that's old story. We never did associate their connection with the committee necessarily with their assassinations, but we never did discredit it either, did we, Fritz? So we really don't know. But at any rate, it was a pretty hectic kind of situation. But the fact that the United States government of America would call in two mafia people to help us eliminate some guy illegally by murder because we disagreed with him is the kind of thing we were confronted with almost across the board during this investigation.
Could I ask Fritz a question? What did we, as a committee, recommend on the assassination rule?
We recommended that it not be done except in time of war. Yeah. And that's the same thing that President Ford had issued an executive order stopping assassinations. You know, it's hard to say, can you ever imagine a time, or can you ever imagine a time when torture might be appropriate? But it's very dangerous to sanction, for example, torture. If you pass a law that says torture is okay, you know, where is it going to stop? And the United States' reputation still matters. And I know our feeling on assassination was, if the United States decides assassination's okay, what nation is more vulnerable to assassination than ours? I mean, we surround people with their Secret Service, but we're still more open than most societies, so we're probably opening a Pandora's box as far as we're concerned.
Pardon me, there's a guy like Osama bin Laden out there who certainly has tried to kill as many of us as he could. Would you understand our recommendation to
stop trying to bomb him? No. Because he's essentially declared war on the United States.
That's the point I want to make. If that rule is a practical one that allows us to do some things if we have to, but what it says is don't use it as a policy, which is what we were doing for a while. If we didn't like somebody, we sent a visitor to see him. And that's what happened in Chile, a sad thing. They had elected democracy, and somebody decided we didn't like him, and we went down there and helped others kidnap General Schneider, whose sin was that he believed that they should follow the Constitution, so he was removed and assassinated. And I think Chile has taken almost 30 years to get over it because our involvement became known. So there's consequences that you have to bear in mind here that we're not being carefully adhered to at that time.
The government and the agencies assumed everything would always be secret forever.
Right.
And they're not going to be secret forever, and when they become known, there's a price that's paid.
Right.
Like Iran, we're paying a price for the coup in 1954.
Right.
So there's no such thing as a permanent secret? Can a government ever keep something permanently secret?
probably not. You know, we're dealing with human beings. But part of what we were just talking about there was we required a reporting to the committees if they were undertaking any kind of action like that. Can the government keep secrets? Never have, but who knows? I don't know.
I think we have to keep secrets in real time. What we're doing during times of war, what we're doing in many ways has to be kept secret. And what the committee recommended and what we asked for, never asked them to, for example, disclose names of agents. We never wanted to know. We never asked means or methods of what. We didn't want to know anything on that committee, which, if disclosed, would hurt the genuine operation. So there's a line here of secrecy that I think every government can operate with under the law and under accountability. And that's the issue, it seems to me.
I've never seen a group generate the kind of hostility that the Church Committee did. In fact, TV Guide wrote an editorial that said 100 KGB agents working overtime for the Kremlin would hardly have undermined the CIA as effectively as Senator Church's committee did. It was a shocking and immeasurably harmful blow to our national security. And they weren't alone. There were a number of people who said that. So how did you respond either then or now to those kinds of charges?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that we saved the CIA instead of if things had kept going as they were with the various press releases coming out as people saw some of the things that were happening, and we've just touched on 2 or 3 here tonight. I mean, the list of the activities of our intelligence community against the individual rights of the citizens of this country would fill volumes. And we could not even, during our over a year and a half of investigating, we couldn't even cover maybe half of them. And some of the ones we did, we had to do it in a rather cursory manner. But that could not have continued. They were losing their effectiveness once the people began to understand, not only people in this country, but our enemies understood how they operated. They were losing what effect they could have, plus they were losing the confidence of the American people, as I pointed out before. So what our committee did, in my judgment, and the subsequent oversight legislation, really saved the intelligence community of this country and probably made it more effective. It could not have kept going as it was.
When this bill, the FISA bill, passed the Senate, it passed by 94-1. It was a bipartisan bill, and part of the reason was it was in part based upon a set of propositions issued under the Ford administration, under the orders of President Ford and by Attorney General Levy, his Attorney General, which spelled out what they thought was needed to bring proper balance. So it wasn't a partisan thing, it was a balanced bipartisan result of people who studied this problem, who thought this was the best way to resolve it. And after that time, 2 or 3 FBI directors said publicly, this has helped save us, we're a better institution, we've gotten out of politics, we're back to professional law enforcement, it's been good for us. 2 or 3 CIA directors said it was the best thing to happen. So I don't think we hurt those agencies at all. I think we helped them.
The Bureau, certainly. I mean, you know, we certainly saved the Bureau because they were spending time on things such as infiltrating the women's liberation movement. And our great Bureau Federal Bureau of Investigation infiltrating the women's liberation movement and writing reports they sent to 16 other agencies about the meetings of women. I mean, really. And that
also
the
sent Martin Luther King's family a letter, in essence, asking
they
to
did
commit
plenty
suicide.
of things to Martin Luther King that Senator Mondale, most of all, got testimony that described, in addition to the documents, this awful campaign. But the those words that I mentioned when my first remarks about the committee and its final report saying it's time for the Bureau to get down to looking at espionage and terrorism and stop thinking about subversion and political ideas, that was very good for the Bureau and very good for the country.
I'm just saying that's something that we haven't emphasized here today. We've talked about our intelligence gathering against foreign countries and trying to know what our enemies were doing. But a major part of what we covered was activities against American citizens in this country. And it was very extensive and beyond what most people even realize today. And the kind of thing that, couldn't continue to happen.
Recently, they got into KGB files, and they just they found a file on Martin Luther King. They hated him because they thought Martin Luther King was a moderate who was diverting black America away from the communist revolution that they wanted them to. So here was some people in the FBI going after King because he was hurting America, and here was the FBI, or the KGB wanting to get rid of him at the same time. And I think it shows that there were a lot of unwise use of those powers.
I have one last question.
Two things that drove our intelligence committee in those days was the Red Scare. Anything that Russia did, we wanted to count. And the other was the local unrest that was brought about principally at that time, I guess, by the Vietnam War. And these agencies were spying on the young people or anybody who would stand up and object to those wars. And those two things were very, very much involved. And to me, neither one of them had a whole lot to do with the security of this country. I never felt that there was really a Red Scare. I knew we were two powerful countries, two most powerful countries in the world. We had different philosophies. But the idea that we were going to fight each other, I don't think that was ever a possibility. I used to think, if Russia and the United States would form a mutual defense pact, it'd kill every cat in the alley. Nobody could attack either one of us forever. But we couldn't do that because a lot of our domestic policy depended on our distrust of Russia, and a lot of their domestic policy depended on their distrust of us.
I mentioned earlier the idea of mission creep, of things starting small and going further. And even accepting Senator Huddleston's comment about the Communist Party not being as much of a threat as J. Edgar Hoover suggested. But the Bureau started this COINTELPRO program, which was an effort to harass and disrupt first the Communist Party. And one might say they exaggerated the Communist Party, but we're not in love with the Communist Party in this country. But then after they started harassing and disrupting the Communist Party, they next went to the Socialist Workers' Party, which they admitted in our hearings had never done anything illegal. Then they went to what they called black nationalist hate groups, but they listed in that category Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference as a black nationalist hate group. And then they went to what they called the New Left, which was a totally amorphous group of young people basically protesting the Vietnam War. So it was another example of starting with the more possibly justifiable and going to the wholly unjustifiable. A tendency that we have to watch out for again when we have a government that is acting secretly and saying that they're out to save the world, and undoubtedly is spreading wider and wider from the starting point.
I have one last question, then we're going to open it up to questions from you. We have two microphones set up here in front, and we ask if you have a question to go to one of the microphones and to try and keep your questions brief so that we can accommodate the most number. But I have to get to this. That last month, Judge Anna Diggs Taylor of the Eastern District of Michigan ruled that the Bush administration's warrantless wiretap program was unconstitutional. Of course, it's under appeal, but the very next day, President Bush said, and I quote, that those who herald this decision simply do not understand the nature of the world in which we live. So I want to ask all three of you, do you agree with Judge Taylor's opinion? And has the world changed that much since 1975, Mr. Vice President?
I agree with the result of the opinion. I haven't read the opinion itself. I understand it's pretty expansive. But the idea that FISA law is binding on the President, the idea that the law itself is constitutional, and that under our Constitution, the President must obey the law that he's sworn to uphold, I agree with that. Secondly, I think that the idea, which we return to again and again here, that if you enforce the law, you're weak, is what he's saying. I say all experience shows that when you obey the law, we can do everything we have to do, but we can do it with the accountability of the courts and under the law of our land, and we avoid stepping over things and making fools of ourselves.
Well, how do you respond to the notion that you just don't understand the world in which we live today?
Oh. You're not baiting me, are you?
No, sir.
Well,
You're doing a good job.
I spent, along with many of you here, a lot of my life in the federal government. I spent it in the Senate, I spent it as vice president, I spent it as an ambassador, and I dealt with security matters, diplomatic matters, and every administration we've had since World War II, Republican or Democrat, has tried to work on the theory that we need more friends, that we need better diplomacy, that we need to understand the complexities and differences and troubles and tensions every part of the world. That's why we have an embassy in every country of the world. It's to get a clue of what's going on there, see? And that is fundamental to the future of our country. And we've somehow gotten into an ideology now where we know about a country without knowing about it, where diplomacy has taken a kind of a lesser role. And now maybe Condoleezza Rice is starting to bring it back. There are some signs that this first idea has failed so miserably that they're slowly, I hope, evolving toward this system that has helped and served our country so much. But no administration, and this will be my only sort of political statement, no administration has celebrated the lack of understanding and the kind of impetuous, reckless dealing with other nations quite like this administration. And there are a lot of good ones there, but boy, I don't know.
Can I bet you, Senator Huddleston?
Well, I think our system will accommodate as it is without impinging on the individual rights of the individual any further than we are now under the present law. I understand the difference between the threat that we have. I understand what we're confronted with. But I believe the mechanism is there now to do everything we need to do to protect our country if we have the will to do it. And it's not going to be necessary to infringe upon the rights that we fought for all these years in order to meet the threat that exists today.
If I'd been writing that opinion, I would not have relied on the First Amendment. I would have relied on the violation of FISA and fitted right under Justice Jackson's famous opinion in Youngstown Sheet and Tube that where the Congress has passed a law, the President has powers are at their lowest ebb. And more generally on the question of the world we live in, you know, the human nature has not changed since our Constitution was developed, and this really unusual document by really unusual people. And when James Madison in the Federalist 51 spoke about men are not angels, now today we might say men and women are not angels, but there he said men were not angels. But men are not angels, and because they are not angels, the first obligation of government is to control the people, but the second obligation of government is to control itself. And we can't forget that, and we can't forget other things about human nature, like the famous comment by Lord Acton that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Those are truths that last through any decade and any century, and we are in danger today of slipping away from those really fundamental truths about human nature.
You see why we brought our attorney along?
It looks like no one has any questions for you, so I guess I'll keep asking them then. If you make your way
Somebody back here wants to ask a question.
to a microphone, please.
First, I'd like to say how happy I am, and it's very unusual for me these days to see a stage full of people, two of whom I voted for, and the other two I have great admiration for. But I wanted to ask this question, talking about the Constitution. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, not the President. And my question is, do you, two senators and other people on the stage, believe that we're at war, or are we only in a war that's been declared by a self-described epileptic reading president?
I think it's a good point.
We're going to bait you one way or the other.
I guess so. One of the conundrums in the American constitutional system is the one that you raised. If you read the Constitution, it looks like it says only the Congress can declare war. And if you read the federal papers, they were worried that the United States would get into all these wars like the European powers did and destroy themselves by these silly disputes, and that they should only go to war in cases of profound gravity that would move the whole Congress to vote them. I would say that the last 120 years, for some reason, that provision has lost strength in the way the system works. In 1972 or 3, we tried to pass a War Powers Act that would provide, to try to deal with this, provide that when a president orders forces into another country in combat, he must come back to the Congress, say in 30 days or something, and get approval. So in other words, we got into Vietnam, we couldn't get out. We got into Iraq, we couldn't get out. The idea behind the War Powers Act was to try to stop it before we got into a place where it gets so difficult to withdraw. But by the time the act passed the Senate, it had been so eviscerated that its chief author, Tom Eagleton, voted against it on the grounds that the War Powers Act would actually facilitate and make war easier for a president to commence. And I'm afraid that's about what's happened.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, a president should have some emergency powers because sometimes action has to be taken quickly. The trouble with what's going on now is that the emergency has become, it's grown on and on and on, and it just is not consistent with the idea of a limited emergency power to have special powers lasting for 5 years, at least if the Congress has begun to assert itself.
Isn't there a question as to whether the president, when he speaks of these powers that he has during the war, which none of us accept that he has any, but assuming he did have, wouldn't he have to have a legal war, therefore one declared by Congress?
Good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. We voted to say you have a power, but then you can exercise it when you determine
Yeah, right.
That's when you try to go to UN and all that, and had the power to do anything else.
Can you repeat that, Fred? What
Well,
said?
the War Powers Act sort of did give the president power to act.
He voted in the Senate and read by resolution to give him the power.
Yeah. But then yes, and the authorization to use military force. But again, that's another example of where a valid idea is stretched beyond its original meaning. That was authorization to attack the people who had attacked us. It wasn't authorization to, lock up people all over the world or to torture them or those other things.
Well, has that ever been contested? This idea of saying if certain things happen, you can go to war, which is the case now.
Well, you're the expert on the War Powers Act.
Well, no, I was just sitting there with other senators when we debated it. Eagleton was the key leader, and as I said earlier, he voted against his own bill because he thought by the time it had been amended, it was going to facilitate, not deter war.
Okay. We have a question over here.
Recently, there has been an appointment of an intelligence czar that is to oversee all the intelligence agencies. If such a position existed back in the 1970s when the Church Committee met, how would that have affected the recommendations that the committee made?
You mean the present conflict that's going on right now? I didn't get it.
Well, I think I heard we now have a central intelligence. What do you call this new officer?
It's a director.
Negroponte, who's supposed to be the single head for our nation's intelligence. This has been an old problem. Following World War II, Truman and leaders got together and they said, we can never fight another war like this one, with different groups going different ways and never getting together. So they established the Department of Defense to bring the defense together, and they established the Central Intelligence Agency to bring American intelligence together, but it never really worked. The CIA has some power, the DIA, Defense, has other powers, NSA, and a lot of times it doesn't come together completely, a lot of duplications, and I think that we need to keep working, and when this bill was passed, the 9/11 Commission said that it wasn't doing what it should do to unify intelligence. And the other thing the 9/11 Commission said was that the Congress should reorganize itself. We've got so many committees dealing with this in the Congress now that Congress is contributing to this problem. So it's a good objective. We're not there by any means.
I believe Lee Hamilton, former congressman and co-chairman of the 9/11 Commission, said the other day that the present intelligence operation in the House and the Senate is dysfunctional.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to it since we left. Do you?
You get rid of talent, and that's what happens.
I can tell you what happened.
We have a question here.
Stephen Shepard on behalf of the College Democrats. It's an honor to have you gentlemen here. I wanted to ask, in your experience, has any other administration used the power of fear on the American people like this administration?
You know, I didn't hear that very well.
Did any other administration use fear as much as this
power
one?
of fear as much.
Yeah.
Well, it has been used before in times of war, times of fear. Most of my generation has seen it used time and time again. So in fairness, this administration, it isn't the first time that it's been used, but it seems to me that that it's being used more consistently, more deliberately, and more patently and apparently than I've seen for a long time. I'm sure some people disagree with me. There's some things to be afraid of. I know that. But what we need is a national and a rational discussion about how to best deal with this. And just to panic people won't work and isn't working.
Yeah, that's good.
Question over here.
My question goes to the idea of accountability, but more in present times. I was wondering how would you rate Congress's how well they've been investigating stuff like the Patriot Act before passing it into law, the lead up to war, the way the war's been performing. A, F.
Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to concentrate on Congress when you got the administration taking so many positions and making so many statements and that sort of thing. I don't know.
Well, there's a new book just out called The Broken Branch by Norman Ornstein and Tom Mann, distinguished political scientists who've followed the Congress for 30 years as scholars. And they point out that the Congress is not functioning as it's intended under the Constitution. And one of the things they're not doing is using the discovery, checks and balances powers of the Congress to keep checking on the executive. There have been very few hard-hitting congressional investigations of key issues. There've been a little bit, but not a lot. It's been a very compliant Congress. When Johnson was president, Fulbright and his committee, Democrats, went after the Vietnam War with the Democratic president sitting there. And I think there will always be some tensions. There should be some tensions between the two branches. But the last 3 or 4 years, it's what the New York Times called a kabuki Congress that operates with the appearance of power, but not the substance of it. And it doesn't work.
It might be fair to today's Congress for us to recognize that in a way their job is harder than the Church Committee's job was, because while the Cold War was still going on when we were working, nobody thought America was going to be overrun. So in that sense, today you can have more empathy for the Congress. But having said that, it's also true that the oversight by the Congress has been exceedingly weak in the last 4 or 5 years. In part, I think, because they're afraid. In part, because of the point you made that where the Congress is more partisan, those who are with the president are much more reluctant to engage in significant oversight, even though the theory of the American government was that the Congress was going to always be checking the president because of the rivalry between the two branches, and now it's a little more the coordination of the two branches for partisan reasons.
I think it's deeper than partisanship. Having been on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, the Democrats didn't do us any favors when we were in the White House. The Congress is supposed to be checking the executive branch. That's the way the system's supposed to be working, and they're not.
Question here, please.
I'd like to thank you all for coming here to the university. We don't get this often, and I wish it would continue. Just a few hours ago, I was in the same building for a logic class, and it seems to me that, logically speaking, it's a philosophy class, and logically speaking, if myself or any of these people or the vice president walked into Walmart and stole a box of donuts, they'd be prosecuted. Similarly, if the president acts outside the law, shouldn't he also be prosecuted?
You want to handle that?
It's a lot of people talk about impeachment, or first place, it's only could be by impeachment, and would that help the country? I'm not sure. I mean, more vigorous oversight surely would. We had the question when we were working about whether we should recommend prosecution, particularly of the FBI people who'd done those horrible things. And we didn't say we were against it, but on the other hand, we didn't pound fists on the table and say we were for it. And I think the reason for that was they'd operated in a climate where what they were doing was expected and desired. So I personally am a little skeptical about prosecution as the answer as opposed to exposure and criticism. But
I don't think we should be talking about impeachment. I've got all kinds of problems with this president, but I think most of them are political, and they have to be decided by the American people about whether they want real checks and balances, real people in the Congress that stand up to this. I think if we convert these issues that we need to debate so desperately, like the Iraq War, the things we're talking about today, convert that instead to a vendetta against the president based on some kind of allegations or based on some kind of impeachment process, I think the American people don't want to hear this right now. I think their instinct is right. We've got to get on to the real questions. The sooner the better.
I think disclosure information will most of the time bring proper results. It takes longer. If you're following polls, you see the direction they're going right now. You see the people, the electorate can make corrections over time, and that's better than proceeding against the president with impeachment, unless it's something that's absolutely ridiculous.
Question over here.
I actually have two questions. The first one is on topic, and the other one is not. Is there a foreseeable way out of our situation now in Iraq, either for this president or for the next one? And we know that in a couple of years there'll be a job available in the White House. Anybody interested at this point to do that again? In 1980, shucks. In 1984, I was 12, and even then I knew that what you were doing was a very progressive thing by having a female on the ticket for the White House. This is the second part of the question. Do you see that being a reality in say my lifetime? I'm 34. That we could see a female or a minority in the White House?
Is this on topic?
No, you said it.
Yeah,
On topic,
my answer is yes, and I think inevitably, because women make up 50% of the American population. If we want the best, we have to look at everybody. Women are becoming increasingly present in the U.S. Senate as governors. It's rising, but we found it difficult to take the next step for chief executive, even though England, Norway, India, Israel, many nations, now Chile and others, have had good chief executives that are women. The rap on women is that they're not tough enough. But those women prove they're tougher than you know what. So I think it's going to happen here. Same thing with minorities. There's a guy named Barack Obama around now. Brilliant, wonderful, impressive guy. We, as a nation, we can't refuse to look at people like that.
Well, on that part of your question, there's a song, something about Lola gets what Lola wants. Yeah. And when Lola starts wanting the White House, she'll get there sooner or later. And it'll happen, I'm sure.
And
So
your
the
first
other
question
part
is
of your
about-
question, how do we get out of Iraq? Well, that's a pretty tough question. A few months ago, or maybe a year ago, I thought the idea of leaving Iraq before we finished what supposedly was our objective was a ridiculous thought. The cut and run thing appealed to me. I knew it was well, my opinion was, and is, that it was the worst mistake the United States of America has ever made. Nothing. Not only was the decision to go there a mistake, nearly every decision they've made since then is a mistake. They did not send enough troops, and we don't have enough troops there now. The troops that went were not properly trained or properly equipped. We thought after we pulled down the statue and the president stands under the mission accomplished sign that we had defeated the Iraqi army, which we did not and have not. They just changed uniforms into regular clothes, and they've been beating the hell out of us ever since. It's an impossible situation. Now, how to get out of it, that's also almost an impossible situation. And I frankly don't know. I think we've got to maybe set a time and say, look, we're out of here after a certain date. our intelligence committee, I think this was the permanent committee, but we had a meeting on the Far East back before it was a big issue. We had all the people in the State Department connected with that part of the world come in and give us a half-day session. And I guarantee you, anybody who was in that meeting would have known that our attacking Iraq, our idea that we could impose a democracy on Iraq was doomed to fail. Couldn't happen. And it has, of course. In the first place, of course, we had the country under surveillance. We controlled half of their land space. They couldn't fly over it. We did every day. 100 United Nations weapons inspectors on the ground checking. And if any hint of a weapon of mass destruction had occurred, we had ships out in the oceans who could obliterate them overnight without sending a single soul in. It was a misguided effort, in my judgment, to enhance the administration's appearance of doing something about 9/11. And it's not going to work for us, but anyhow, that's how we get out of Iraq. We don't until we just decide we get up and go.
Yeah. Could I just say, my dream is that somehow America can disenthrall itself from the belligerence that we have toward each other in America, and that we can begin to apply rational, sane debate and hearings in the Congress and in our communities to try to come up with an answer for this terrible problem. I think we've got to begin to get out of there, but I don't think that either simple answer is going to work. But what is missing in America, I think, almost astoundingly, is we're not having the debate. We're not having the hearings. We're not exploring fully what the options are. And I think that is that's what happens when the checks and balances and the openness of American government is slipping.
I think one of the problems is, Fritz, I think on that is that nobody wants to say something that denigrates what our servicemen are doing.
Absolutely not.
We've got men and women on the line getting killed every day, and I've been very careful about not even making the kind of statement I've made tonight, because I've been in combat, and I know if you're not getting support from back home, it makes it a lot worse. Of course, we didn't have that problem in World War II. But the problem that you have pointed out is the thing: how do we get a discourse going on a level basis of people who are not cut and run people, but people who want to find the right kind of solution to that problem? And I'm not sure that this administration is ever going to encounter that kind of a situation.
We have time for 2 more questions, so if you would, please.
Good evening, gentlemen. First of all, I'm honored to even be in the same room as you all, and we agree on a number of points, mostly everything you've had to say thus far. But I'd like to revisit your assertions regarding targeted assassinations. In the absence of some countries of democratic processes, and in the presence of dictatorial practices, totalitarian governments, Saddam being an ideal example, how can we justify going to war with the entire populace and the government of a group of people who are not adequately represented? In the event of Saddam, we have one man ruling an entire country. Logically, not everyone in that country is going to support the actions of their leader. How can we justify going to war against the civilians therein without actually taking process against the leader?
Fritz, you want to handle that question?
You know, I'm not sure I've got a perfect answer for that. I know when we thought about Castro, the policy judgments were, first place, it's going to hurt the reputation of the United States. Second, it can be turned back against us. Third, what's going to happen next? And in the case of Cuba, we sort of reasoned that if Castro was killed, his brother would take over, and that would be worse. So it's not always a simple question, and I think analyzing it, one would have to take all those other facts into consideration. And I don't know if that's, I'm not sure that's a perfect answer to your question, but I think it's factors that are important.
what I was getting at was that you gentlemen pointed out that you couldn't think of a single instance and that there was no example possible where target assassination would be acceptable. But as we've just heard, that it has to be part of a larger decision. I think we need to maybe reconsider our ideas on how we do that in order to preserve the maximum amount of life in the dire event of necessary war.
Good point.
Yeah. This will have to be our last question.
Going back to when you were discussing the Church Committee's findings regarding the question specifically, should the U.S. adopt any of the techniques or the tactics of its enemies, and applying that to the current war on terror, do you all see the solution as possibly achievable through military means? Would it require strictly diplomacy or a combination of both? Or is there a technique that we haven't explored yet as a country that could sort of meld these two together or avoid either one?
You're talking about Iraq?
Terrorism.
The war on terrorism specifically.
Oh, yeah. We will never be strong enough to occupy the world. And we will never be able to kill every one of our enemies. And so we have to have policies to try to increase the number of friends, the number of partners, while decreasing the number of enemies, and while taking other steps to deal with particular terrorists and so on who are coming at us. But I think it's a broad, deep problem. That's why I refer you to the 9/11 Commission. This was a bipartisan commission, Republican and Democrat. They looked at everything and they came up with a splendid report, balanced across the board, that goes to the question, very good question that you've asked. It takes balance, it takes comprehension, it takes a full panorama of efforts by our nation over perhaps years to help reduce the risk that we now confront.
Before we finish, I would like to ask this distinguished panel if you have any concluding remarks. Mr. Schwartz, before we finish.
Well, first place, this has been a lot of fun. We had a great experience. You guys were in the Senate for a long time, and I was lucky enough to be with the Senate for 2 years. And American democracy can work well. And that's what we should all aspire to have it do. And I think the most fundamental point looking forward is a point that was made a moment ago. We should have a dialogue in the United States that's based on facts, it's not based on fear, and wrestle with these tough issues in a responsible way. And I think Jefferson was right when he said, an informed public is usually going to get it right. Now, the public isn't sufficiently informed today, in part because of secrecy and in part because of fear suppressing information. But we need to put our trust in the people and hope for that kind of open dialogue, which we were lucky enough to have in the 1975 and 76.
Senator Huddleston.
Well, just to zero in on the subject of this hearing to begin with, is that in order to do those things and make sure we are properly informed, we do have to have a good, effective intelligence operation in the country. And I think we have demonstrated through our hearings and through the information we gathered and the subsequent bills that were passed that we can correct those problems and we can operate under a reasonable and lawful way and achieve this end. And I think that's the thing we need to continue to dwell on and insist on. And then, of course, our decision makers have to take that information and make the right kind of decisions, and hopefully we'll be able to elect the right kind of decision makers.
I think the history of America has repeatedly shown the tension between fear and faith. Fear that our system doesn't work, fear about each other and our patriotism, fear about our ability to confront an enemy, and fear about our capacity to even protect ourselves. On the other hand, faith in our laws, faith in our Constitution, faith in what democracy and enlightened people can produce, and the willingness to trust that system to be the most basic source of security for us all. I think today, once again, just like in World War II, we became afraid of Japanese Americans, and we rounded them all up and put them in concentration camps, even though many of their sons were in the U.S. Army over there in Europe with the Huddleston. It was irrational. We were afraid. And so we did something that we're sorry about now. Because in our fear, we acted. Time and time again, the Alien Sedition Act. In my state, in World War I, we rounded up a lot of the German-American mayors and threw them out of office because we were afraid of them. That fear almost always impedes us, always makes it look weaker to the world, less sure of ourselves. We've got an adversary. We have to deal with that adversary, but let's do it with faith and confidence and strength.
Good. If he'd made that speech in 1984, he'd been elected president.
Here's a copy of
it. Before we end, I just want to add that we can continue this dialogue tomorrow morning at 8:30 in the gallery of the William T. Young Library. These three distinguished guests will be there to meet again with you as students and to talk about some First Amendment issues. But I also want to thank two people without whose work this simply couldn't be done. That's my co-director, Terry Birdwhistle, and most of all, Esther Edwards, wherever she might be. If you would please give our three distinguished guests a rousing round of thanks.